Hello and welcome back to the second part of Let's Build an E-commerce store with a Spring Boot backend. Episode 2 is going to be focusing on SQL Server setup. So what's the objectives for today? Firstly, we're going to set up a SQL Server. Secondly, we're going to make our Spring Boot app connect to the SQL Server. And then lastly, we're going to create a basic data object to test the SQL Server connection. For the first portion of this video is going to be obviously focused on downloading and set up SQL Server. If you already have a SQL Server developer instance set up, then you could probably skip the first part of this section. There'll be a comment in the description of the video saying at what point we finish setting up SQL Server and focus on the Spring Boot side so that you can just skip to that element. So without further ado, let's go over to our dev box and start our SQL Server setup. Okay, so welcome back to our dev box, and now we're going to install SQL Server. So what we're going to do is we're going to Google for SQL Server Developer Edition. We're going to click this first link here. This will take us to the Microsoft website. Now what you're going to do is you're going to come down here and click on the download now for the developer version. The developer version is a full-featured free version of SQL Server which you're allowed to use within development and test database environments. So basically anything that's not production. In a production environment you would use SQL Server Express, which is the one on the side here, which is free in certain applications but obviously has restricted feature sets. They have a full version of SQL Server which you can pay for, but you can also use SQL Server on Azure, which you pay for per use. So we're going to hit download now. I've already got it downloaded, so I'm going to go to my downloads folder here and find SQL Server 2019 SSEI dev. I'm going to run that. Now this installation is going to be a little bit snappier for me because I've got it all pre-downloaded. So we're going to hit custom for our installation. We're going to specify where we want it to download the media to install with. So we're going to just hit install. This might take a few minutes. I'm going to stop here and I'll come back when it's ready. Okay, so it's downloaded the installation media and now I have this little pop-up box here. So we're going to come down to installation on the left and then we're going to select new SQL Server standalone installation. And that's then going to bring up this dialog. So this is where we're actually going to install SQL Server. So we want to specify developer as our free edition. We're going to hit next. We're going to accept the license and terms. Obviously you should read all of these. We're going to enable that just so that we keep getting our latest security and other updates for SQL Server through Microsoft Update. And then we're going to see this and it's going to start to install these files. So again, I'm going to pause here and I'll come back once it's done. Okay, so now we've got it installed, so it should be almost ready for us to finish the installation process. So we go next, and this is where we select the components of SQL Server we want. Now we're just going to use the database engine services. If you're familiar with SQL Server, you may want to install some of these other features if they're of any use to you. However, for this tutorial, we're not going to need any of these, so we're just going to hit next. And then down here, this is where we configure instance. Now instances is a way of having multiple versions of SQL Server running at the same time. If this is your first time installing, you're not going to need it to change anything here, so we're just going to keep default instance. If it's not your first time, then I would hope that you know what you're doing in this scenario. So we're going to hit next. And next comes server configuration. This is just talking about user accounts that it was set up to be able to manage the server via services. Again, you can just hit next here, not worrying about that. Now this is where we're going to configure the authentication. Now for our SQL Server instance, we want to be able to sign in with both normal username and password authentication and Windows accounts. Now Windows authentication mode basically means that if you have a user account on your PC, that user can log into the SQL Server. Usually that's on a domain level, on an enterprise scale. But for us, where we have our Spring Boot app, our Spring Boot app may not run as a SQL Server admin. It may not run as a Windows account. So it's just easier if we have a specific username and password we can supply. So by default, SQL servers have this SA account, server admin account. or system administrator account. So we're going to give this account a password. I'm going to give it password 1, but obviously in your scenario, you're going to give it a much more secure password. And then down here, we're going to click Add Current User, and that will give your current Windows account full administrative permission to the SQL Server. So you can see here, Win11 box. Win11 is my machine name and my username. So that's going to allow me the full access. The rest of this stuff we can all leave as default. So we can hit Next now. And now that's all ready, so we can review our little set of configuration that we've specified here, and then we can just hit install when we're ready. And again, this is going to take a couple minutes, so I'm going to pause here and I'll come back when we're done. Okay, so now as you can see, I've finished installing. You can see that all these bits and pieces have successfully installed. There's no error messages on here. If there are, I'm afraid you're either going to have to try and solve it yourself or maybe post a comment below and I'll see if I can help you, although I'm not going to claim to be an expert SQL Server administrator. So we're going to close this now, but we're going to keep this original box open because here we contains a helpful link for us to quickly go to our next tool we're going to install, which is the SQL Server Management Tools, more commonly known as SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio. So you're going to click this link here, which will download another executable file, which is SSMS setup ENU. You're going to double click on that. And this one's still a tool that's used to manage SQL Server instances. It's very, very widely used, very helpful. It also installs Azure Data Studio, which is their kind of new flagship version, but we're not going to be using that. We're just going to use SQL Server Management Studio. So you get this dialog come up. You can specify the location you want, but we're just going to hit install. And again, once this finishes installing, I'll be right back. Okay, so now SQL Server Management Studio has finished installing, so you can just hit close. And the same could be done with that other dialog that was here before. So now we're going to have to do just a few little bit more configuration pieces just to make sure that our SQL Server is able to be connected to. So we're going to go into the Windows taskbar here and we're going to search for SQL and we're going to look for SQL Server and then whatever the version is, 2019 in my case, Configuration Manager. We're going to open that up. And as you can see here, we've got protocols for MS SQL Server, that's the instance, under SQL Server Network Configuration. You can see here TCP/IP has been disabled. It's disabled by default. We want to open up the properties after a right click. We're going to go into enabled and we're going to set that to yes. Now this is going to open the port 1433 so that the Spring Boot application is able to actually connect to it. So we're going to hit apply. As you can see here, any changes made will be saved. However, you'll need to restart the service for it to actually take effect. So you can hit OK, OK. Then we come up to SQL Server Services. We're going to find the one that's running, which is R1, SQL Server, MS SQL Server. Right click it and hit Restart. And that's going to restart the SQL Server instance in the background, meaning that we'll be able to actually connect to it using TCP/IP connections. So that's now restarted. We can close this out. So before we can connect our Spring Boot application to the database engine, we have to have a database on it for us to actually connect to. So we're going to go to our start menu again. We're going to go to SQL and we'll find Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio 18 or whatever the version number you've got, which is what we just installed. We're going to open that up. It does take a second or two the first couple times, but once it's open, you don't need to really close it because it's not very power hungry. So server name, that's going to be localhost or the machine name. It should default it for you. And Windows authentication, we're going to leave that on because we ticked it so that we can use the mixed authentication. So we don't actually have to worry about putting in a password. Just hit connect. And now we have our SQL Server connected here. We can see it. So if we go into databases, we can see there's no database. So let's make one. So we're going to right click on database and hit new database. And under database name, we're going to put e-commerce as the database name. And for the rest of the stuff, we can leave it default by now, unless you have specific requirements to change any of those items like collations or anything like that. Just hit OK. So now we have a database here called e-commerce. And if you come in here, we've got no tables, there's no data in it, it's just an empty database. What we can do now is we can now go into Spring Boot and actually create our connection. But first, we need to think about what do we need in our Spring Boot application. Well, if we go into our POM, what dependencies do we have? We have the actuator, we have the starter for the web stuff, we have the dev tools, but nothing about Hibernate in here. So a good trick about this is, if you know that you need to add something else to your Spring Boot application that you don't already have there, you don't want to have to go Googling to figure out what dependencies or anything like that you need. The good thing is, if you go to start.spring.io like before, and you come into here and you set it back to a Maven project, set the version again to be the right version, but ignore the rest of the stuff because you don't really mind about that, and go into add dependencies. Now, the thing we're looking for is called JPA, which is the Spring Data JPA package. So it contains all about the Java persistent stuff, so saying that a data class is an entity, and it also contains the Hibernate configuration for Hibernate to utilize the JPA functionality. So we're going to just click on that, and that adds that dependency. Now, because we're using we're using SQL Server for our database, we need something to know how to communicate with that. So what we need is the MS SQL Server driver. And that allows the Java language to know how to communicate and talk to the SQL Server server in the background. Now, if you're using something else like MySQL or Oracle, you'll need to switch that out. So the really nifty thing about this website is that you can come down here and click Explore, which allows you to view the files that you would be generating without actually downloading them. So you can see in here, we're in the pom.xml. If we scroll down here just a little bit, we can see Spring Boot Starter Data JPA and MS SQL JDBC. These are two dependencies that we need in order to connect to the database. So we're going to highlight those and copy them. Come back into our project, and we're going to just drop them in. So now we have the Spring Boot Starter JPA, and we have the MySQL JDBC. I'm going to hit this button here, and what that does is it loads the Maven changes into my IDE for me. So you can see back there just a second ago, it's importing all the new dependencies. So before we finish this tutorial, this episode of the tutorial, we're going to create just a temporary test data object just to make sure that the connection is going to work, and when it works that we get our table on the other side. We're going to create test data object as a class. Now in the next episode and onwards, I'm going to be using an extension of IntelliJ called JPA Buddy, which allows me to create all of this code very quickly for me without having actually to type it all. Now, what I will be intending to do is when I use that tool, I will go through the code it generates to explain what it is that it's doing. So there's no sort of gap of knowledge for anyone who's not using IntelliJ or JPA Buddy. So we're going to put @entity above this one though. So for this episode, we're just going to write it by hand. @entity signifies that this is a data object. And if we hover over here, we can see that it's saying that we need to have a primary key. So we're going to do @id to indicate that this field is a primary key, and we're going to call it private long ID. And then we're also going to give it another column, and that column is going to be a string, and we're going to say username, for example. So now we have a data entity in our project. So finally, the final thing to do is to come in our application.properties here, and we're going to put in some configuration properties to tell Spring Boot how to connect to our database. So we want to do spring.datasource.username. So this is the username to log into the database server with, so SA in our case. And then spring.datasource.password. And the password I set earlier was password1. And then finally spring.datasource.url. And this is in the JDBC format, so it's JDBC : SQL Server : / then the host name, which is localhost, semicolon, database name, which is equal to e-commerce for us. And then for SQL Server, just because we're in a local environment, it's not properly configured as a production environment, we have to do these extra two flags. When you go to production environments, you have to do something slightly different. but you'll come to that when you do production environments. So we're going to do semicolon, and we're going to say encrypt is equal to true. Helps if I spell encrypt correctly. And then another semicolon, and we're going to say trust server certificate equals true. Now if we hit our little run button up here, we should see, as we build the application starts up and complete initialization. Now you see that there's no errors coming up here saying that we haven't specified the URL. There's also no errors here coming up saying about along the lines of, oh, I'm not able to connect. It's all connected fine, which is brilliant. If you've got errors here, I would heavily advise you to go and investigate into why the errors are there. Maybe do a bit of Googling, but also you can feel free to comment in the description, in the comments below, and I will try my best to help you. Now, if we go into SQL Server though, and come back into tables, and we hit F5 to refresh, there's no new table for our new data object. Well, that's because by default, Hibernate doesn't know to go and create a table. Now, in our actual production environment, we wouldn't just have Hibernate create the table. Normally that's not a great idea because you don't know what Hibernate's going to do. It's a bit unpredictable sometimes. You would usually have your own set of SQL scripts, or you would use a third-party tool like Liquidbase or something like that to populate that. Now we'll go into that further down the line, but when you're doing your initial development, you're going to be changing the database a lot. Having Hibernate create those database changing SQL bits and running them for you, it's going to be very helpful. So to enable that, what you want to do is you want to search for, because you don't remember it, auto DDL, I believe it is, DDL. Here it is. It's this one. spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl auto. Now what you set this to depends on what it does. So if you put in create, it will create the schema and then destroy the previous data, which means it's going to build up. Every time you hit start, all data in the database is going to get wiped, and it will create a new schema out of that. You've got create and drop, which will create it and then destroy everything at the end of when you stop the application. You can do none, which means nothing happens at all. You can do update, which updates only the bits that need doing at the time of starting. So it will go, oh, the data object didn't have this field before, but it does now, and the table doesn't have that anymore. So I'm going to add that in, which is what we're going to choose. And you also have validate, which validates to make sure that the data object you've got in the code matches the table descriptions and table schema in your database. So we're going to hit update here, and then just hit the rerun button. And as you can see, the code is compiled, it's started up. And if we go into here and refresh under tables, here we go, test data object. And if I select the top 1,000 rows, we can see my 2 columns, ID and username. Perfect. So it's done it all for us. That's brilliant. So as we started off, what were our objectives? Set up a SQL Server. We've done that. We were going to connect our Spring Boot application to connect to the SQL Server. Brilliant. And then finally, we're going to just test that it was actually connecting. And that's what we've done with our test data object. So what I'm also going to put a note here is there's 2 things that I'm going to note just before we wrap up the episode. So firstly, in the description, there will be a link to a GitHub repository. Inside that repository, you will find the code for all of these tutorials, and each tutorial will have, I believe it's a separate branch or a separate tag to mark the end of what the code was at the end of that episode. So if you're in episode 2 and you want to start from the beginning, then you would take the branch of code of episode 1 and start from there. But if you wanted to see what the code was like at the end of episode 2, you would look for episode 2. So that gives you the ability to see the before and after of each episode, and you can also see what the changes were because you'll be able to do the difference and comparisons on the branches. So hopefully you're familiar enough with Git to be able to understand that. The second thing to note is that during this, you may have some problems when you're doing your connection relating to dialects or to drivers. Now, if you've set up everything up correctly, it shouldn't be a problem, but sometimes that 1 in a million chance happens. There are two things that I can point in the direction of. You've got the first one is spring.datasource.driver class name, and you can see here for me it's defaulting to Microsoft SQL Server JDBC SQL Server driver. That's the kind of the pointing the direction of which driver you're using. So if you're using Oracle, that would be the Oracle driver instead. The other one that might be of help to you would be spring.jpa.properties.hibernate.dialect, and this is where you can specify the dialect specifically that you're using with Hibernate. So if Hibernate's complaining that it doesn't know what dialect to use, this is how you specify it. So you can just go org.hibernate.dialect.SQL Server 2008 dialect. And that's the one for SQL Server for the one we're using. However, obviously, the idea is that all of that, those two properties should be automated. So fingers crossed you don't have that problem. But if you do, those are the things you want to look out for. So thank you very much for watching another episode of this tutorial. Now, this is hopefully the last episode we're going to focus on setting up software or anything like that. The next episode, we're going to start from fresh. We're going to remove those two test classes we've got, and we're actually going to start building up the data objects to represent the model of our application. So please feel free to tune in for the next episode. And as always, you'll find the videos in the playlist in my channel. Thank you very much for watching. Feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.